Hello, everybody. Welcome to the War Room Podcast, the War and Conflict theme podcast, where every single episode we discuss a different topic from war and conflict. I am one of your hosts, Kyle. Joined with me, as always, is my co-host, James, also known as my
Hello.
dad. Good to have you on. And for today's episode, we are talking about conscription. Now, we are going to be doing an intro into conscription. We're going to look at some examples in history, both world history and U.S. history. We're going to look at what it is, maybe kind of hopefully dispel some ideas about what it is. I think it's a thing that people just know is the draft, and they probably know it from a pretty U.S.-centric point of view, but a lot of people that even know that part don't know the system by which it manifests itself in the U.S. So we're going to go into a little bit of history on the draft or conscription itself, and go through some examples, as well as talk through some of the data and studies that have been done to try to show why exactly conscription is a thing that a nation would do over another. What are some of the predictors that we might be able to look at to be able to take that down the line? That is what we have in store for the episode. If you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, please do. On whatever podcast service you're currently listening to, we'll be able to upload. You'll get a notification whenever we upload a new episode. Also, if you're watching us live on twitch.tv /The War Room Podcast, you can actually follow us there, and you will get a notification anytime we go live. We usually tend to do these on a Sunday. We're doing this on a Monday because it is President's Day, so we had it, and Sunday was Valentine's Day, so we wanted to, be able to spend Valentine's Day. And also, but normally, we do these on Sundays, usually every 2 weeks or so, but we're still working on the cadence for that. So make sure to subscribe wherever you can, follow wherever you can. It will help us as well as help you get notifications anytime new things come out. So with that in mind, I think we're good to go ahead and get into conscription. Anything you want to say before we start?
No, we're good. Go ahead and define this sucker.
Cool. So before we do anything, we are going to define a couple things. There is different ways to define conscription, and it is going to be one of those definitions where we're going to pick something, but there's really not a super set one definition, because it gets a little gray in its language, especially when we look at some other things like impressment. So with that said,
it's partly because it's global.
Yeah. There's like literally, like, the French have a different definition for it than the U.S. does, and
correct,
things like that. So yeah, it is one of those words where we'll have a working definition for ours, but you'll probably be able to find variations. There's a bunch that don't distinguish difference between draft and conscription or interchangeable. I don't necessarily think that's the case, but with that being said, we have a couple definitions we can use. The Oxford one is just compulsory enlistment for state services, typically into the armed forces. Keyword there being compulsory, meaning that you are compelled to join a state service, most commonly associated with armed services. There's another one I found, which is the legal and regulated form of forced labor for the state, usually in the military, but sometimes in other activities. So, for example, technically speaking, under these guises, jury duty in the U.S., that is conscription. Yes. Based on the fact that you're being compelled via a law or a regulation to engage in something for the state. Now, you are being compensated, but you're being compensated as a soldier as well. So it doesn't actually change the definition. The
fact that you're being paid doesn't change anything.
Yeah. And there are a bunch of countries that do that actually do compulsory service for, like, state labor things. So you go and work for a state agency, essentially. Sometimes on top of or in lateral to military conscription. So that's the kind of definition we're looking at, is that it's a compulsory thing. You're being compelled. That's not the same as being forced per se, because it gets a little messy once we start to look into that. So, for example, go ahead.
It does. It gets kind of gray. But the other thing that the definitions really are not saying is that it is compulsory service. However, almost everywhere that has it has exemptions.
Yeah.
So it there are a lot of exemptions.
Yeah.
And we can get into some of those things. So it's not like a unilateral thing.
Correct.
It's based on policy.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to implement it. And largely it's very rarely what we would consider like a universal conscription, where it's just anyone that fits this bracket, essentially like the age of a fighting force. Usually they add in as well like male, especially in the past, for service members. But yeah, conscription, we do want to be clear, conscription is different than impressment. So
Yes.
impressment is defined as the enforcement of military or naval service on an able-bodied but unwilling man through crude or violent methods. That's from the Britannica, I believe, Encyclopedia Britannica. So that is our primary distinction, is that there is a difference between forcing someone into the military service via violence, essentially, and conscripting someone via a regulation. Now, that gets messy because there are times when a regulation can be created by the sitting government or by whatever the governmental body of that area is that creates the laws and creates the regulations, but still be crude and violent by the means it pulls people in. So it can get really gray. But essentially the idea is we want to distinguish between the military creating a draft via a lottery system that you're enrolled into on a certain date, and the British Navy just stealing American naturalized citizens and bringing them into the Navy without paying them. Like, there's a big difference there. One is under the threat of death, essentially, by an external power that doesn't actually have regulatory control over you, and the other is a set of laws.
Yeah, I mean, I would really use. I would say it's probably more governed towards cartels, warlords, things like that.
Yeah.
That are going into towns. They don't actually have any actual authority over any of these people. However, they use violence to come in and steal children, young children. And they take them, they indoctrinate them. That's impressment. They're not being drafted. They're not signing up for selective service. Yeah. These people aren't governing them. Honestly, they're not governing them. And there's no policies in place for the governance of that conscription. So it's impressment. It's a different entity in and of itself. You can have conscription through violence. That is true. A lot of people will find that around the world.
Yeah.
It's really a matter of, is there a policy, and are you recognized as an actual governing body?
Yeah.
Versus just an individual warlord.
Yeah. And to add on to that, I don't think we're gonna, and we've talked about this before, but I don't actually think it's as beneficial as we might assume to look at the moral implications of conscription and things like that, just because, again, when we are talking about war and conflict, bringing morals into inherently immoral, destructive behavior isn't not necessarily conducive to actually getting to any point of what it's doing, per se. It is an interesting conversation to have, and I think it's a fair conversation to people to have, but for the sake of what we're doing, I actually don't think that it's super necessary. So we're probably going to avoid that.
It's going to be...
Oh, real quick, we might be... I'm seeing a little bit of skipping on my end.
Yeah, you've had a couple...
Give me 1 sec to make sure everything's working. Oh. That's a little bit better. Okay. Yeah, I just had a weird hiccup there. But anywho, with that being said, that's kind of, those are our definitions of conscription. That's kind of what we're going to be using, is just that state service, essentially. We're primarily going to be talking about military service, but just be aware that this doesn't necessarily just mean that. This is some other things along the way. Any other thoughts about like the definitions of conscription? I'm going to get a little bit more into like the history, and we can talk a little bit about what kinds of different conscriptions there are before we get into the like examples we have. But any other thoughts on that?
No, I think it's good. Honestly, the how it's used is more important than the definition of it.
Yeah, no, I
Honestly,
agree.
that's
I
more.
think that's fair. When we actually look at the history of conscription, it's kind of difficult because we can assume that impressment and conscription have kind of happened all throughout history. But as far as
Mhm.
like using historical records to be able to pinpoint more specific times, the earliest around that we've been able to see is the 27th century with the old Egyptian kingdom. So essentially, they cut their region into areas that were all managed by governors, and those governors were actually in charge of creating their own standing militaries. Those military forces were they were made up of a lot of people from the lower class, so people that didn't necessarily have trade skills, that weren't contributing in that part of that area. So they were brought into the military, they were trained, they were fed, things like that. That's kind of the earliest historical example we can find of conscription. But it's been
Well,
used. Oh, go
I'd
ahead.
like to say in Egypt, they used it not just for their military, but they also used it for a lot of their other state programs.
Yeah.
It, I know when I was a kid, the it was a common belief that the pyramids were built by slaves.
Yeah.
However, recent history shows that's not actually true. They found camps and cities where the artisans and the builders of the pyramids lived, and basically a lot of them were conscripts, and they were conscripted for several months, depending on their job,
Yeah.
and then they would return to their homes and do whatever business their family business was. A lot of your artisans were conscripted for 2 years, and then they would rotate out, and another artisan would then rotate in. So it's just a very convenient way for you to have a workforce to do the nation's bidding.
Yeah.
Back then, it would be the pharaoh's bidding.
Yeah.
Uh, without having to resort to violence. They gave them places to live. They gave them rations of food, actually rations of beer as well.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't. It probably was not frowned upon, and I guarantee you there were probably exemptions even back then.
No, 100%. Especially when you look at a lot of the examples we'll talk about. Funny enough, you'll notice people of higher political power tend to have more control over who's actually conscripted than people
Yes.
of a lower class. But yeah, no, that is a good point. Egypt had a history of essentially contracting and conscripting artisans to build their. Now, I believe they still did use slave labor, but from the standpoint of like building like the architectural design required and things like these things required to be planned out. They were required to be built. They required to have a hand of someone who had trade skills. These are actually all things that currently go into evaluations of conscription as well. We can get into that when we look at it, but there's a lot of calculation that goes into the process of figuring out what is like the optimal way to conscript people, things like that. So yeah, good context. So the other thing I want to talk about is another definition, and we talked about it a little bit, but there's actually a difference between there's a couple different versions of conscription, but there's also one important distinction, which is universal service and selective service, or universal conscription, selective conscription. There's a bunch of different terms used, but usually it's in the guise of there's something universal and there's something selective. Essentially,
Correct.
the difference is a universal service or a universal conscription is a very, very broad distinction that says people from this age to this age. And like I said, usually they add the caveat of
A gender.
Male people are going to be pulled into the service. So that it doesn't select for skill. It doesn't select for like their current contributions as a civilian. It doesn't select for a lot of things. It essentially just pulls people in. And then
Correct.
from there, it usually has some kind of sorting process to figure out what people can do and things like that. These actually are not that common. They have been used, and there's examples of them being used. But by and large, there's a pretty high cost of dead weight, essentially, associated with this system. So when you have a process that brings in every single male from the age of 18 to 35 within a nation, you then have to have systems in place that evaluate the abilities of all those people. You have to have a system in place that funnels them into the positions that are actually required without making any position have too many people or too little people. It actually introduces a lot of really difficult logistical things into the system, and costly things as well, that actually don't make it that beneficial in a lot of scenarios. There are scenarios where, people have, like Prussia as an example, they implemented it and they actually were able to maintain. That's one of the reasons they were able to fight in World War I, was because of the massive standing army they had raised with universal conscription.
Yeah, I would say that universal conscription is generally only used in a short term.
Yeah, that's fair.
It's defined by a need.
Yeah.
And it's not sustainable,
Mm-hmm.
mainly because when you conscript a third of your population, that's a third of your workforce that is now not doing whatever functions they needed to be doing. So it isn't sustainable unless you had an enormous population with a high, out of work ratio.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, it's, farmers need to farm, factory workers need to build, drivers need to drive. There's a lot of things that make a country work.
Yeah.
And when you conscript a third of the population, especially your able-bodied population,
that makes sense.
It's not very sustainable.
Yeah. There's the universal service, which is what we just talked about. And yeah, you're right. There's not the scenarios where you implement it are pretty far, few and far in between. But there's the more common one, which is selective service, which is essentially a service that selects one. Sometimes it selects for like particular individuals with particular skills. It can also be selective service in that it has a population of people that it looks at, but of that population, it only selects a few people, either via some system of ranking in order to like maintain a civilian population, or based on like aptitude, or there's a whole bunch of ways you can do it to like be selective. But the idea behind it is that it's selecting for something. It's not just taking the total population that's within that frame. It's taking that number and then narrowing it down to whatever the needs of the nation are at that time, or the needs of the military are at that time, or the needs of the state, if it's not a military thing in there. Because this is also a thing that's done with, like currently the U.S. has a list of all people that have trade licenses, and doctor licenses and things like that. That list is maintained by the U.S. government in case there was ever emergency where doctors needed to be conscripted. I guarantee they literally have a list of what would be the policy, what would be the process, who would be the people that would be getting letters from that. So that's the idea behind selective services. Kind of more focusing on what you're actually getting and how much you need and things like that, instead of just doing a more wide a spread of just whoever you can get.
And they track volcanologists. They track if you have a unique skill or a unique education or training, they're tracking it. If Yellowstone looks like it's going to blow up, every volcanologist that's been trained in the last 2 decades or 3 decades is going to get a phone call. And if you've been one for 4 or 5 decades, you're definitely going to get a call. So they're tracking all of these things for not a purpose of subjugation, but really as a way of finding the people with the appropriate skills at the
Yeah.
appropriate time it's needed.
Yeah, exactly. It's the idea. If this is a, especially when we're talking about extremely, like COVID's horrific, but if we're talking about a disease with the spread of COVID, but with a insanely lethality, now we're talking about something that could literally destroy the country. Conscription looks a little different when we're talking about like extremely high level threats. Conscription of the population into just state service, as far as that goes.
Extinction events, things like that. Those things you look at conscription differently. That's absolutely true. When it's survival of the country, survival of the planet, survival of your way of life, you do look at it a little differently. You're right.
And I think that's a good point, because it kind of highlights when we look at conscription, even as a military service, we're lucky in that the U.S. is relatively stable, especially when it comes to interstate conflicts or conflicts with other nations, especially military conflicts with other nations. But I mean, if I'm a country like I don't know if I want to name any particular, but if I'm a country that is being ordered by an aggressor, Israel is a perfect example. It literally could be the difference between the destruction of an entire nation. If you don't have the standing, if you're a small country with an aggressive neighbor that you're, regardless of how you feel about the Israel-Palestine situation, if you exist in that scenario where you have pretty serious, deadly conflict that could, evolve, it makes sense to be able to ensure you have a standing military and a standing resource to be able to fulfill that military. So the proposition changes depending on your perspective, depending on where you are and what situation you are. So there's a lot of stuff around that for sure. And again, this is something it's kind of been off and on used around the world. Europe started implementing it quite a bit during the 17th and 18th centuries. But again, it's one of those things where even in the U.S., like, it's come and it's gone, and it's come and it's gone, and it's come and it's gone. And there's a very possible chance it could come again. There's really no way to know. It's entirely dependent on what the nation needs at the time. Now, again, we do have some data we're going to go through that looks at the likelihood of conscription based on some factors that a nation has. But by and large, it's pretty difficult to tell, to be frank.
I would like to say that conscription is absolutely allowed by the citizens to some extent. So a lot of people won't agree with conscription at all. Okay, some people are just opposed to it, period. Okay. However, if the majority of the citizens agree with it, it tends to stand, tends to stay. If an entire nation disagrees with the conscription, odds are you won't have it. It's a polarizing issue. And so even in countries where the citizens have less actual power and authority, at some point, we have a finite lifespan. At some point, it's going to change.
Yeah.
If enough people disagree with it.
Yeah. And there's also some factors of, like, if a nation's been, like, there are nations that are just inherently set up to more easily implement draft policies and conscription policies that makes them more likely to engage in it because the cost is lower, essentially. But we can get into that a little bit later. But yeah, there's a lot of scenarios where you would do it and a lot of scenarios where you wouldn't. And it really is dependent on the situation and how that situation changes over time. Now, we talked about some variations on conscription. I have a list of 3, but you might be able to add more if I'm missing anything. So I have 3, which is there's standard conscription as we imagined it. Again, that's not usually what happens. Usually, what actually happens is conscription with some kind of exception. So I have in here a couple different ones. Now, there is conscription with exception. We kind of already talked about. That's usually something to the effect of people age this to this have to enlist in the military or do 2 years of college, and that counts towards either all of their military service or some of their military service. There's also exemptions where these people are in a particular field that can't be, we don't think is effectively removed or can be damaged, a civilian field that can be damaged by pulling them out, i.e. like doctors or something like that, to where it's, okay, we don't want to have a shortage of doctors and a surplus of soldiers.
Exactly. So a lot of them, they won't exempt you just for going to school. They will, however, exempt you if you're going to school to be a doctor or to be an engineer.
Yeah. There's specific language on what to do and things like that.
Exactly.
Some of them I do think will just let you go to school, period, and I think it counts.
Some countries, yes.
Service, yeah, but
some countries, yes.
Yeah,
but not all. There are exemptions, and then there are categories of exemption.
Exactly. That's the most common one, especially in modern day. But there are two that also exist that I was able to find. One is conscription with buyouts. And there are actually still some nations now that do this. It's definitely more like a lot of the examples I found were in the past. But there are still nations that do this. But the idea is it's conscription, but there's actually literally a fee that can be paid to the government that gets you out of that conscription. So I think one example, I don't remember the country I found it in, but there's one country that like you pay $15,000 and you don't have to join the military. The idea being is that, there's a couple ideas behind it, but that essentially you're giving them money that is now entering the system, that you're effectively working for your nation. There have been some pretty unscrupulous ones as well that have happened in the past, where essentially this is just a rule that's written in to let rich people not have to go to the service. And lots of times that's kind of how it ends up, but that's definitely one as well. A little bit less common in modern history, but definitely something that existed before as kind of a workaround.
Well, the U.S. I gotta find it here real quick.
Talking about the Civil War?
The Civil War.
Yep.
Yeah. And in the North, you could avoid military service. Substitute soldiers were permitted to be hired for a $300 fee.
Yeah.
So for a $300 fee, you essentially would not have to serve, and they would find someone else to serve in your place.
Yeah.
So when they're doing a lottery, think about this. When you're doing a lottery, okay, and you come up, you could literally say, okay, here's $300, and they would go and draw another name.
Yeah. And mind you, this is $300 at that time. So this is closer to like a couple $1,000s now.
It was,
but
whatever the rate was at that time.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's just not a foreign concept.
Yeah.
We actually did this not too long ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I believe the idea behind that was that people that are willing, and I think it's a dumb concept, but the concept that I had read about that they had proposed for why they, because this was a very, that buyout option in the Civil War was actually a super controversial thing that people routinely had issue with. But the claim they made as to why it made sense was that if you were willing to pay to get out of military service, then you would be poor at that service anyways. So at least they get money out of you, which is a dumb concept.
War costs money. War costs money.
It is kind of I feel like it was written by rich people to excuse rich people stuff. To be honest, I don't think that makes 100% sense,
but I would say that it was probably a fairly common thing. In the past, it's less common now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No. It's definitely
more acceptable.
Yeah, 100%.
Classes were kind of set in stone, and they were accepted.
Yeah.
People did question it.
Not a lot of economic.
A long time ago.
Yeah.
Correct.
You were poor, and your family was poor, and your children were poor.
And they were going to stay poor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it wasn't. People didn't really think that they were getting hosed.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly,
yeah,
back
no,
then.
100%.
They just accepted it.
Yeah. And there is this one's. I don't actually think I couldn't find any modern examples of this next one. This is the last one I have on my list. But I think it's a really fascinating one, which is conscription with replacement, which is actually where you could get, if you were conscripted, you could get someone to take your place, essentially. Which is, I believe it comes from the French originally that had this concept. But it led to this where it was implemented, it led to this very interesting system where people would actually become professional draft replacements. So
yes,
they would get paid by someone to take their place. They would go and be conscripted, and then before they actually went into service, they ducked out, went AWOL, and then just went and did it again.
yes,
and they would just go around being conscripted and then leaving and conscripted and living and just making money off of that, which is a really interesting idea or concept.
Now, that is not a foreign concept either. Believe it or not, the U.S. had that same policy. Well, I don't want to say the U.S. The Confederate States had that policy. So they had a system where they had exemptions, and you could pay anything to an individual for them to take your place. So the way it worked is that in the North, you could pay $300, you could get out of it, and they would draw somebody else's name. In the South, or the Confederacy, what they had in place was that you could pay anyone any amount and they could take your place. And so how that works is, right, if you're if you find somebody that's really desperate, you could probably get out of the Civil War for $20.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not that, once again, that's not a foreign concept either.
Yeah.
That's something that actually did take place right here. Now, it didn't take place for long, partly because of what you're talking about. Okay. People would come in, they'd sign up for the war, they'd show up, and then they'd hightail it out of there. Find somebody else that was in line to draft, say, hey, for $50, for $30, for $10, and then they would go in and sign in again under a different regiment, so on and so forth. So it didn't even last long in the South because it doesn't work very well for you. But when you're desperate, you turn towards these types of measures.
Now, obviously, I don't think that's a thing that could even work in a lot of modern examples, because a lot of that relies on, or a lot of that system relied on, essentially it preyed on the fact that information wasn't available and it wasn't collated. And
you can't get away with it now. Just because
too much information,
it's not
too easy to collect and too easy to store.
In an archaic system where there's no checks and balances, and you could walk away, give a different name. Now, you'd be hard pressed to be able to really do it now.
Yeah,
you're right.
That makes sense. But those are my three like variations of conscription I could define, and there's a lot that like use a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this, as we kind of already shown.
Correct.
Were there any more you can think of other than those three I listed? So replacement, buyouts, and exceptions. I guess there is kind of one that I just thought about. If you don't.
No, go ahead.
So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's also a little bit of, I don't know how I would describe it. I guess it would be like hereditary conscription almost, but like the example is like samurai in Japan, where essentially you are brought into the military based on your family history. You actually have to. I don't know if it would necessarily count as conscription. We'll talk about that.
It's happened all over the world.
Yeah,
No,
like
that is a form of conscription.
yeah, I think that's like an interesting
It
one
would
as
still be
well.
selective, though.
Mhm.
You're
Yeah.
selective. Another one that I would say is conscription for citizenship.
Oh yeah, that's true.
And that one is kind of unique because the individuals that you're conscripting are not actually citizens
Hmm.
of your nation.
Hmm.
Um, and so it doesn't happen as much today, but it happened a lot when one nation um, essentially was running another nation's government.
Hmm.
The British were all over the planet
Yeah.
at one point. So they were um, these countries were their own entity.
Hmm.
However, they kind of were being ruled by England.
Hmm.
And so there was a form of conscription where you would actually conscript people from another nation
Hmm.
to serve. And the promise was that one, you're going to get paid, two, you're going to get X and X
Hmm.
benefits, but the main one was you were going to get citizenship to this other nation.
Hmm.
So it's a unique thing, and it probably doesn't happen very much nowadays.
Yeah.
But back when you had colonies,
Mm.
you had to have people in place in those colonies
Yeah.
to maintain whatever law and order you had.
Yeah.
Or you wanted. And so
Mhm.
one way was to conscript local nationals
Hmm.
into a force that worked for you.
Yeah.
And one of the things was that you would then become a citizen of the blank
Hmm.
nation. And so it doesn't, you're not going to see much of that anymore,
Hmm.
because that system is pretty much dead.
Yeah,
It's from a
that
bygone
version of
era.
that system, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not valid today,
Mhm.
but I would say that it was very valid
Yeah.
200 plus years ago,
Yeah.
where you would conscript for citizenship, and it's
Mhm.
a unique thing. That's about the only one that
I think it's fair.
was
Yeah.
prevalent
Mhm.
globally. It was prevalent globally before, but it's not
Mhm.
really now.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, no, I think that's fair. That's a quick look at like the just a brief history of like what conscription is, what are the variations of it, and things like that. I think I kind of want to get in some examples now to kind of show a little bit more of what we're talking about. Do you want to start with the U.S. or do you want me to start with some small examples and then you can work to the U.S.? What do you prefer?
Um, well, yeah, I mean, I could start with the U.S. if you want.
Yeah, let's go for it. Also, heads up,
So,
careful tapping your mic, because it makes it like a ding sound
oh,
when it moves.
sorry.
No problem.
So this is the timeline of conscription in the U.S. From the colonial era to present.
Hmm.
So in the colonial era, in times of need, each colony calls to arms all adult male citizens who group together to form colonial militias. Um, in the Revolutionary era, General George Washington is forced to call on state militias made up of poorly trained and led citizens who often leave service at inappropriate times to
Hmm.
return home to tend to their farms.
Yeah.
Now, the reason that I'm talking about that is because it brings up a very important point
Hmm.
in that if you conscript people,
Hmm.
those people had a place in your society before you conscripted them.
Yeah.
And if you conscript all of your farmers
Hmm.
to whatever type of service, you don't have any farmers left.
Yeah.
And if you and I'm saying, let's say able body, maybe
Hmm.
you have a bunch of 70 or 80-year-old farmers, and they're great. They could teach you how to farm, but if there isn't anybody to do the work,
Yeah.
you can damage your nation very quickly by doing that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Funny enough, the working like the age range most commonly used is like 18 to 35 for military service, but that's also a huge chunk of people that are working labor jobs are also going to fit.
Well, that's your prime, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Physical.
That's your prime.
People.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Now, once he became president, he tried to remedy that inadequacy in the nation's military by proposing legislation that men be registered for service and assigned to military units for training. Now, keep in mind that this isn't that they would take a list of all able-bodied men.
Yeah.
But he was actually proposing that they be assigned to military units and trained, meaning that they would be forced to actually train in military engagements. Congress did not pass they did not pass that suggestion, nor did they pass legislation that was proposed by President Adams, Jefferson, or Madison for similar type of things.
Yeah.
And then now in the Mexican War, okay, a 1-year enlistment period of large numbers of American troops under General Winfield Scott, I think it's Winfield Scott. It expired as he was moving into Mexico City. So this is another problem with conscription, by the way, and that's why I'm bringing it up. So the time that these people were conscripted for ran out as he was actually going into Mexico City, and the military action had to wait until replacement troops could arrive.
Yeah.
So that's why you have to be careful how you use conscription. It's important that you plan accordingly.
Yeah.
So essentially, we're talking Mexico City. Their time expires as they're entering Mexico City.
Yeah.
So they have to stop.
Yeah.
And wait for other people to come and replace them.
And this is at a point where those people had to get there via like a train line and horses and
well, I mean, this is the Mexican War, so this is 1846 to 1848.
Exactly.
People were not moving quickly anywhere.
This is a lot of logistical moving to get a bunch of people out and in.
Now, we talked several things about the Civil War, and I'm gonna skip. We're gonna come back to the Civil War. I'm gonna skip ahead past the Civil War. So please, everybody, don't freak out. So, 1917. This is
that would have been after World War I, right?
No, there's the Spanish-American War. Okay, it was 1898, and Congress declared that all males between 18 and 45 are subject to military duty.
Wait,
so that was this is general.
You said this is 1917 or this is 18?
No, this is 1898.
Oh, okay.
All right. So this is the beginning of the Spanish-American War.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
They say everyone, all males between 18 and 45 are subject to military duty, period. Okay. Now, in 1917, so this is right after the Spanish-American War, Congress passes the first Selective Service Act.
Wait, so this is during World War I, 1917?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
It established local, district, state, and territorial civilian boards to register, classify, examine, and either induct and ship out or defer men between the ages of 21 and 30 for service in World War I. So they learned something between 1898, the Spanish-American War, and World War I, is that you can't get everybody. So you see that they're being selective on who is going to go and who is not going to go. Now, that doesn't mean it's fair. Selective doesn't mean fair. I don't want anybody to misconstrue that. It's just being selective. There was much opposition to that draft. During the first drawing, 50,000 men applied for exemptions, and over 250,000 failed to register at all. There was a roundup held in New York City in 18 to catch those that had failed to report. 16,000 men were arrested. 1920. The National Defense Act.
Hold on real quick, your video.
Go for it.
Okay, you're good now. Your video, I don't know if the audio was frozen, but yeah, you're good to go.
Oh. So We're going to 1920. The National Defense Act established a system of voluntary recruitment. Okay. The reason that's important is because drafting people is an ugly business, and it takes a lot of manpower and resources to police it.
Yeah.
Having a voluntary recruitment system is actually different because people are coming to you.
Yeah.
You still will have people that will desert and things like that, and you have to govern and mess with all that. But it's much better than just drafting people and all that things. It's much easier to manage as a nation. All right.
Yeah.
So 1940, Congress enacted the Selective Training and Service Act. So it's a little bit different.
And for reference, 1940, this is pre-war. Well, so World War II is going on, but the U.S. is not engaged in World War II.
We're not involved in it yet.
Yeah.
Right. So Congress had the Selective Training and Service Act. All males between the ages of 21 and 35 are ordered to register for the draft, and the first national lottery is held. So that was a national lottery versus a local lottery.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay. Draftees are shipped to Army induction centers and the country's first peacetime draft. Okay.
Again,
Later,
peacetime for us. This is again still
correct.
World War II is raging at this time, but 1941 is when the U.S. gets in.
Exactly. So this is pre. So this is a peacetime draft. This is you're drafting people and you're not actually in a war right now.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's why it's unique because you're not actually physically in a conflict.
Yeah.
So you're drafting
in preparation.
Okay.
Probably.
It's a little harder to justify for when you think about it, right?
I mean, I can remember. I feel like I remember reading about this, and the argument was that Congress effectively knew at some point they were going to be pulled into World War II. So the idea was, let's get the system implemented,
get geared up
now. Exactly. Yeah. Then
exactly
do it later.
And start training before you actually need the training.
The amount of time it takes to ramp up the system and the people that you're actually pulling.
Yeah, but just remember that the people that are being drafted are like, wait a minute, we're not at war.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
there's some unique things. It's unique. Yeah, it is. Okay, now 1941, everything changes. Okay, so following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Congress gives the president power to send draftees anywhere in the world. Now this is important. The reason it's important is because Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Congress gave him permission to send draftees anywhere in the world. Meaning that he could go to Europe, he could go to Southwest Asia, he could go to Africa.
Yeah.
Okay. So it gave the president the latitude to send people anywhere on the planet. Draftees anywhere on the planet.
Yeah.
Okay, so that in and of itself is somewhat unique. Okay. It also removed the distinctions between draftees, regulars, National Guard, and reservists, creating a one army made up of all. So it broke all the barriers that distinguish different types of individuals.
Yeah.
Okay. It said you're no longer a guard or a reservist. You are now, the army.
Yeah.
We'll just say
this man's.
You are now one of the national forces. That you're the Navy, you're whatever. But my point is that you are now a regular. Period.
Yeah.
Everyone's a regular.
Yeah.
At that point. Now in 1947. All right. So this is kind of unique too. But in 1947, President Harry Truman recommended that Congress, that the 1940 Selective Training and Service Act expire, and that the level of required military forces be maintained by means of a voluntary enlistment. So this is 1947. He's like, hey, let's get rid of this.
Yeah.
And have nothing but volunteers.
Yeah. And the war had ended at this point, both in the Pacific Theater and.
Oh, definitely. Now, however, by March of the following year, 1948, in the wake of the escalating Cold War, President Truman asked that the draft be reinstated as the level of military forces falls below the necessary numbers.
That makes sense.
The new Selective Service Act provides for the drafting of men between 19 and 26 for 12 months of active service. So within a year, the individual that recommended that the draft disappear is coming back saying, oh my gosh, we need a draft.
Yeah.
We need something in place. And that's why I feel that's a unique thing. It shows how quickly the landscape can change.
Yeah, there's
where
also
this archaic system is now necessary again.
Yeah, there's also I believe it was in World War II, the initial draft from the 1940 one was written so that I believe you only had a year of mandatory service. That was actually amended once World War II started. So it became
it's always
you were
fluid.
in until you were
it's
put
always
out.
Fluid.
But that leads to an interesting thing, which is, and we've talked about this before, which is this service members don't have the same rights that civilians have. And as soon as you become conscripted, you become a service member, you effectively lose a lot of civilian rights that you once had.
Correct.
You now don't get to dictate whether you get to come back home in World War II.
Correct.
So there were people that were told, at the beginning of the war, this was going to be a year process. That ended up in Europe and were there for the full 4 years or the full 3 years or whatever their tour was.
Right.
For that
well,
time.
World War II had weird things where if you flew a certain amount of missions, your thing was done. If you had a certain amount of battles and engagements, you had a clock that ticked back based off of what you did and where you went, less than how much time it took. So somebody that was constantly in the fighting may get home fairly quick if he doesn't perish.
Die,
Whereas somebody else that missed a couple of battles here and there, missed those points for whatever reason, and they were there much longer.
Yeah.
So the last one that I'm going to talk about is 1952. And this one is very important because we still this still happens today. So Congress enacts the Reserve Forces Act, compelling every man who is drafted or enlisted to an 8-year obligation to military service. After a term of active duty is completed, one is assigned to a standby reserve and can be called back to active duty upon a declaration of war or national emergency. So why is this important? This is important because if you draft somebody, and let's say their term of service, once drafted, is 1 year, you own them for 7 more years.
Yeah.
It allows them to keep those people for second tours, third tours, fourth tours, fifth tours.
It's a contingency, essentially. It's we plan that we're only going to need you for this time that we say, but if for some reason that changes, we can just bring you back if we need to.
It's really a way for them to be able to get you without a contract.
Yeah.
Honestly. And so
and this also applies to voluntary people that are voluntarily service.
Correct.
Right?
Exactly. People that volunteer. So let's say they joined for 4 years. They're in an inactive reserve, ready reserve for an additional 4 years. Okay. Now that's changed. That changed to 10 years at one point. It can go up to 12 years. It can go to however many years. Now, what the requirement was is that these individuals, if they decided to move, they have to report that they've moved.
Yeah.
They get assigned to another unit within, this inactive ready reserve. Now, there is another one that the U.S. uses beyond that. So, perfect example. I signed up for the military. I re-enlisted more than one time.
Yeah.
At a certain point, I met all of my requirements. So let's just say, for example, that when I enlisted, I was required to give 10 years of service or inactive service or guard service, one of the two, right? So when I'm at 12 years, I've met every benchmark and every requirement of service, right?
Yeah.
So my termination date, my ETS date was coming up, and I was transitioning out of the military. I got called up and said, "Hey, can you come in?" I was like, yes, sir, I can come in. I come in, and he has a set of orders, and it says, "You're going with us to Iraq. You've been stop lost." Now, why is that unique? It's unique because I signed a contract and I fulfilled all the requirements of that contract. However, the US government still had the ability to send me to Iraq, even though I had already fulfilled all of my obligations.
Yeah.
Now, you talked about rights, right? I did not have the right to refuse.
Yeah.
That is another form of conscription, believe it or not.
No, yeah,
I didn't have a choice.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Said, no, I'm not going to go, and I could have spent time in jail. If that makes sense. So, yes, you have a choice, but you don't have a choice.
Yeah.
I was going to serve the time, whether I was sitting in jail serving it, or serving it and getting paid.
Yeah.
So we're not. We use conscription as a nation for our own advantage, and whenever we feel that it is necessary.
Yeah. And I think that leads to an interesting kind of concept. And we already talked about it a little bit, but to like further just like clearly exemplify what it is, like that idea that as soon as you can get people in the pipeline of the military as a draftee or a volunteer, you essentially can do whatever you want with them. At the end of the day, you can change the rules to fit. You can change the rules needs to be set. Which is something I like whenever people talk about joining the military, especially young people, I always try to remind them of is like, it can be a great thing. Obviously I've not been in the military, but I've known a lot of people that are, and worked with a lot of people that are, but, is to just know that at the end of the day, they own you. Like they'll tell you that they'll give you this job and that you'll do this job. And that very well might be the case. And it is to their benefit to maintain that to a certain level. But at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, if they want you to do something,
if they need you somewhere else, you will be going there.
Exactly. And that's just the way of it.
And they've got things written in that allow them to really get away with that.
Yeah.
So the last thing I said, we were going to come back to the Civil War.
Yeah.
And the reason I wanted to skip past it was so that we can get through all of, kind of up to the modern time.
Yeah.
But as I was researching this, I found something that was very unique, I thought.
I agree.
And it's not something that I had ever heard of. So in the Civil War, the Southern, the Confederacy, I'm just going to read this. Poor morale and numbers of troops result that the age limit for draftees is amended to include men between 17 and 50. Can you imagine being drafted at 49?
Honestly, or at 17. Yeah.
Well, that's true. That's true. Even at, and then in 1865, the Confederate Army begins the conscripting of slaves. Now, why is that important?
You said 1875, right?
No, 1865.
Oh, 60. I was like, okay, wait a minute. I was like, the war ended.
No, 1865.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay. The reason that's important is because a lot of people believe that the Confederacy would never have African Americans or
Yeah.
slaves
at that time. Yeah.
armed.
Mhm.
All right. That was kind of that's a thing that all the history, they would never arm the slaves because,
Yeah.
well, for obvious reasons, right?
Yeah.
They would turn against you. However, I actually was like, that sounds fishy.
Mhm.
So I went to try to find it. I had difficulty finding it. Kyle's a wizard and actually found the document
And
that they were
real quick,
talking
if
about.
you want to read this document, we'll have it linked in the description to where you can find it.
And this is from what they were. This has been put electronically in by Cornell University.
Yes,
Correct?
there's a book that essentially just contains various records from the Civil War that have been written down and then put into a bunch. It's not just one book; it's an entire series. So this is from those excerpts. So this is straight from a document that was written during the time.
So I'm gonna read it, and then I just kind of want to talk about it for a couple of minutes because I think it's so interesting.
Yeah.
So the following act of Congress and regulations are published for the information and direction of all concerned. An act to increase the military force of the Confederate States. The Congress of the Confederate States of America do enact that in order to provide additional forces to repel invasion, maintain the rightful possession of the Confederate States, secure their independence, and preserve their institutions, the President be, and he is hereby authorized to ask for and accept from the owners of slaves the services of such number of able-bodied Negro men as he may deem expedient for and during the war, to perform military service in whatever capacity he may direct. Now, I would like to say that I'm saying Negro, but that is because that is what is written.
Yeah, this is written by the Confederacy. So if you think it's racist, it's because it's the Confederacy of the.
Yeah. So I'm not putting a word in that isn't there. I'm actually just reading the document.
Thank you.
So I hope that no one is offended. I'm just reading.
That's fair.
I didn't write it.
I think it's fair.
Section 2. That the general in chief.
I was going to say real quick, just to make sure that part's fully understood. So essentially what that is saying, because there's a lot of it's written kind of older type of language or English. Essentially what that is saying is that the President of the United States can ask, and it's not pulling slaves. The owners of these slaves are able to give essentially the ownership of those slaves to the president. They're able to distribute their slaves according
before
to.
We get into that, let's read the whole thing because there's some other things in here that are very important.
Yeah, I'm just saying that's the initial paragraph what it says for layman.
Yeah. Okay, so section 2, that the general in chief be authorized to organize the said slaves into companies, battalions, regiments, and brigades under such rules and regulations as the Secretary of War may prescribe, and to be commanded by such officers as the President may appoint. That while employed in the service, the said troops shall receive the same rations, clothing, and compensation as are allowed to other troops in the same branch of the service. What this is saying is that they're going to be given the same uniforms, the same equipment, the same food, and the same pay.
Yeah. Which is crazy to think that the Confederacy would, even though I'm sure they would probably do their best to avoid actually that section. Even the fact that they would write that down and ratify that is crazy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's this. Think about this for a second. That paragraph is basically saying that those soldiers are equal too.
Yeah. This is effectively
all the other troops.
Yeah,
it is. It's absolutely saying that. So they're right there. That's equality.
Yeah.
By definition.
Now.
Okay. So
yeah.
I'm just saying. Now, keep in mind that this is just what they're writing.
Yeah, and also we're still talking about people that are owned. Like it literally says in there that they are owned by other people. So
we're talking slaves. Yeah. They're saying slaves straight up.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
There's more here.
Yeah.
Okay. That if under the the previous sections of this act, the president shall not be able to raise a sufficient number of troops to prosecute the war successfully and maintain the sovereignty of the states and the independence of the Confederate States, then he is hereby authorized to call on each state whenever he thinks it is expedient for her quota of 300,000 troops, in addition to those subject to military service under the existing laws, and so many thereof as the president may deem necessary to be raised from from such classes of the population, irrespective of color, in each state as the proper authorities thereof may determine, provided that not more than 25% of the male slaves between the ages of 18 and 45 in any state shall be called for under the provisions of this act. So in this one, they're saying if not enough owners of slaves give up slaves, they are allowed to take them.
Yeah.
As
Up
long as they
to-
don't deplete
Yeah.
the population
Mhm.
down to a specific amount, the 25%. They can't
Yeah.
go below the 25%. So they could take 75% of them,
Uh,
basically.
Oh, it says not more than 25% shall be
Okay, I'm
provided.
sorry.
So they can't go lower than 75%.
They can't go lower than 75%.
Yeah.
Exactly. So up to the 25%.
Yeah.
So that's important because it says, hey, if they won't give them to you voluntarily, you're
Yeah.
allowed to go in.
Yeah, it also
And
talks. It also speaks to what we had mentioned with conscription. Of it's horrific, but for the Confederacy, their economy and a lot of their institutions were literally built entirely off of and based entirely off of slavery. So taking too many slaves from that system would have collapsed that part of it. So like that was part of their calculations for conscription. As horrific as it is, again, just thinking about it from a
Now,
correct standpoint.
Section 5, that nothing in this act shall be construed to authorize a change in the relation which the said slaves shall bear toward their owners, except by consent of the owners and of the states in which they may reside in the pursuance of the laws thereof.
Yeah.
So it's saying that, they don't want this to be misconstrued and that there is a
Quality or
change in the
freedom.
relationship.
Exactly.
There's not a change in relationship. It's still master slave. It's basically what
Yeah.
that's my interpretation of that. Okay. Now, so that's section 5 of chapter 1. Now, chapter 2, the recruiting service under this act will be conducted under the supervision of the adjutant inspector general. Okay. And this is just talking about how they're going to initiate the recruitment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then it says that in chapter 3 that there will be assigned or appointed for each state an officer who will be in charge of the collection, enrollment, and disposition of all the recruits that may be obtained under the first section of this act. One or more general depots will be established in each state and announced in orders, and a suitable number of officers will be detailed for duty and staff and departments.
Wait, there's quite a bit of these. Are you going to go through all these, or are you just going to go through a couple?
I'm just going to go through the kind of the important ones.
Okay.
So
there's like
they're establishing depots to be able to do this. They're allotting for that, accounting for that.
Yeah.
So the next one is 4, and this is kind of important. The enlistment of colored persons under this act will be made upon printed forms to be furnished for the purpose similar to those established for the regular service. They will be executed in duplicate, one copy to be returned to the office for file. No slave will be accepted as a recruit unless with his own consent and with the approbation of his master by a written instrument conferring, as far as he may, the rights of a freed man, and which will be filed with the superintendent. The enlistments will be made by the war, and the effect of the enlistment will be to place the slave in the military service conformably to this act. The recruits will be organized at the camps and squads and companies and will be subject to the orders of the general-in-chief under the second section of this act. So what this says is that while the master can decide how many and who goes, they still have to volunteer.
They have to sign a paper, essentially.
The slave itself has to effectively sign saying, yes, I'm willing to do this.
Yeah.
Now that is unique. And they even use the term freedman in there.
Well, the freedman's referring to the owner, I believe, in that sense.
No. I believe that's actually what's happening is that there's a change of contract. The master is signing over the slave. He's consenting to giving up his property. The freed man is the slave who is consenting to join the military. That's how I read it.
The rights of a freedman in which he filed by the superintendent. Written instrument conferring as far as he may. Well, it says, I think the master. I actually don't think that's how. I don't think that's correct. I'm reading the sentence. I think it is, because the master is the subject in the sentence of his master by a written instrument conferring as far as he. Actually, that's hard to say. I don't know.
I think what's happening is there's a transfer here. The owner is transferring ownership
to
the military.
Yeah.
The consent happens in the middle,
mm-hmm.
and is signed as well.
Yeah.
So in that time in history, you could Abraham Lincoln did it. Lots of people did it.
Mm-hmm.
They literally went to an office and they signed a document saying that slave was now a freed man.
Oh, yeah. Actually, Ginger's probably right. She posted in chat. Freedman usually refers to people who were formerly enslaved. So
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So what's happening is there's some documents that are taking place that says, hey, this person is now a freedman. Now he can consent to join your military.
Okay. I think that's
right. So what you're seeing in this paragraph is the Confederacy is actually suggesting freeing slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So that they can continue their war effort.
Yeah.
So the next chapter is just talking about
logistics,
reporting.
I think, yeah.
And that he will report and show the names of all the slaves recruited with their age, description, and the names of their masters. One copy will be sent to the general-in-chief and to the adjutant and the general inspector. Now, why is this important? I believe it's because this is where they do the reach around. Or they turn it around in the end.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that anybody that survives the war that was a freed man is going to end up having to go back to a slave owner. And they want to make sure that that gentleman's property is being returned to him.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And that's why I think that is written.
That
report, they want to know if this person's property has died in combat.
Yeah.
Died from disease, if he, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Now there's another one that I really want to get into. Let me just find it real quick. Give me a second.
Yeah. While you're finding that, yeah, I do want to be clear that, like, at the end of the day, this document is in no way trying to change the view that this South had on slavery. This is and we talked about this is essentially an act of desperation. By this point, this was written in I think March of 1865, so the war would literally end within a couple months, and they knew they were losing by quite a margin. So at this point, it had become, what is the app? What can we do? And this was like a last-ditch effort to try to find some way to hold on to victory.
Right. Now, the final chapter, I think, is unique, and probably a lot of people won't believe that the Confederate States actually wrote this.
Yeah.
And they actually approved it. And this was actually voted on.
Yeah, this is a weird one.
All officers who may be employed in the recruiting service under the provisions of this act or who may be appointed to the command of troops raised under it, or who may hold any staff appointment in connection with them, are enjoined to a provident, considerate, and human attention to whatever concerns the health, comfort, instruction, and discipline of these troops, and to the uniform observance of kindness, forbearance, and indulgence in their treatment of them, and especially that they will protect them from injustice and oppression.
Yeah, that is a crazy act to come out of a Confederate ratified law. So this was ratified by their standing government.
Now, the Civil War ended less than 30 days after this was approved. So it never got off the ground.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people that have this view of a apple and orange. The North and the South were apples and oranges. Yeah. And the truth of the matter is that they really weren't apples and oranges. They were apples and apples.
Yeah. In a lot more ways than people would think, but yeah.
Yes. And this absolute view of the South being complete racist. And now keep in mind that this is
they were that, to be
for their own.
So
no.
The North.
What I'm saying is that, but it was written because they were desperate.
Yes.
And it was a resource that was available and that they weren't using.
Yeah.
They also had seen the North use this to some positive effect for them. And so I think it's very unique that one, that nobody knows about this.
Yeah,
I've never heard of it.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, I thought it was profound. For me, it was profound that my view shifted slightly as far as how actually desperate these folks.
Yeah, they were willing to, and again, like, to be clear, based on everything that the Confederacy had done to this point, I don't think they had any intention of fully. This is, at the end of the day, words and how it's implemented. I don't think they had any intention of some of these things. But
I don't believe that they planned on freeing them in the end.
Oh, I don't even think they planned on treating them well, but I think they planned on treating them well enough to fight for them. I also imagine this would have led to a lot of just actual rebellion against them, to be honest, from the inside. So.
Well, keep in mind that
it's probably why they didn't do it earlier.
The militarily, things are a little different. And so when you say something, you can actually enforce it with violence. Okay. When you say something to your citizens, okay, you say, hey, don't speed, we'll give you speeding tickets. It's frowned upon if you enforce that with violence. Okay. In the military, you can absolutely enforce things with violence.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say that analogy doesn't quite hold for this, because the slaves already had their actions enforced with violence, as not in the military.
But what I'm not talking about for the slaves. I'm talking about for the officers.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
See, so disobeying an order, it has a risk to it.
Yeah. Okay, I see what you mean.
So it's a little bit different. Now, granted, they were going to treat them however they were going to treat them. Yeah. That's absolutely true. But there was something in place.
Yeah.
That governed their treatment.
Yeah. The fact that this exists at all is crazy. That I will. Yeah. I think that's 100% fair. And like, even that last sentence, which at the end of the day it's a cop out. It's to say, like, hey, we need to be able to at least give them like food and have that not denied by people. It's essentially like knowing that they're racist, that last statement of, protecting and equality and stuff like that. It's understanding that they will be met with racism in their institution and that they can't further diminish their fighting power. But even the fact that they wrote that implies that there is you're right. The implications of it are that they recognize that there's some kind of, there is some kind of equality that's possible.
Exactly. That's why it was so important to me, is that even in a conflict where, I don't believe it was over slavery. Honestly, I believe there were a lot of factors involved. I think slavery was just one of the factors.
Well, slavery is the primarily one historically, but I don't want to get too. I don't want to get too into that.
But my point is that even when you were at that point, these individuals recognized the need to treat them a certain way in a certain position.
Yeah.
And that's important. For me, that's important. It says that even your most diehard individual, racist or whatever, there is potentially the idea that you should be treating people in a specific manner.
Yeah, even if it's
that's what was profound to me. No, and I'm probably not saying it very well.
No, I think I get what you mean. And to be fair, we are talking about desperation, and we are talking about essentially having no other choice but to do so. But even that, like I said, even the fact that it exists, I think is kind of mind blowing. Just because it's not a thing I'd ever heard of.
All right, so we should move on because I probably wasted way too much time.
No, you're good. So we're at 1 hour and 30. So I'm actually thinking we'll run over some of the data, and then I think we'll probably be able to close out at 1 hour 45, something like that.
All right. Well, did you want to talk about the?
I might go over one of the examples briefly because I find this fascinating, which is, I think a lot of people have, so Japanese and Chinese history. I'm lumping those together because they're very old. Chinese history is extremely old. Japan has a really, really old history as well. And nations with extremely, I'm just using them as an example, but we can use a bunch of other ones. Nations with extremely old histories, I find really fascinating when their traditional history meets with modern history and the changes that come with it. Specifically, there's actually a very interesting look at the reason Japan decided to create conscription services, which is actually because of samurai. So we all have this image of samurais, but samurais were still around into the 1800s. The feudal system in Japan was not removed until 1868. So prior to 1868, to serve in the military in Japan, you had to be born into the warrior class, the samurai class. I believe at the time, at that point in history, in the 60s or 1860s, there was 1.6 million samurai spread across 400,000 families. So it's not like it's a super small group, but it is selective in a weird way, and that it can only be done through hereditary passing along in particular families.
Correct. And they were a closed society.
Yeah,
that helped to keep that system in place.
Again, it was a feudal system, so the samurai worked for the shoguns and the leaders of the regions that worked usually for the head emperor, shogun, or whatever. And then they effectively, one, engaged in conflicts, and two, kept the peasants and ensured that they provided food and provided land and all the things they needed to do.
Collected taxes.
Yeah, exactly.
All
a mixture of a military force and a law enforcement, essentially. But it leads to a really interesting point, which is how do you transition away from a feudal system, which is where that's the only real system by which a conscription by hereditary means can thrive, to a prefecture system, which is what they moved to. They essentially said in 1968 there was effectively a military coup that overthrew the current empire, moved the capital to Tokyo, or what would become Tokyo then, and made the guise of establishing a national military. It actually removed all feudal benefits, like wholesale. So essentially, this would be 1868. Sorry. The entire samurai kind of lost all the power that their family had gained. And now there was no standing army. There's no national army. Every person that was in the military at the time was a samurai. So they actually developed a conscription model off of necessity. And funny enough, because they developed a national army, they actually had to use that newly founded national army to fight a whole bunch of rebellions from samurai. So
Correct.
the samurai actually fought the Japanese government after this decree against that new national government. And then they had to further develop training and things like that to put down these rebellions. But I think it's a really interesting look at conscription in transferring from a very traditional way. And military service was looked upon in this like very social class kind of way. Like you were upper class if you were in the warrior class.
Yeah, exactly. There were ways for your family to get into the warrior class.
Yeah.
Um, it,
Marriage and as well
merit, merit. Like
Mhm.
you had the people that were fighting, and then you had the people that served the fighters, right?
Yeah.
It was a system. It was a class
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
And you break into another class, but
Mhm.
only under specific circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah. By and large, you were still usually stuck where you were, but yeah.
And there was a way for you to adopt
Mhm.
essentially people.
Yeah.
If there was for example, if your family's bloodline was petering out
Mhm.
for whatever reason, loss of children, so on
Yeah.
and so forth,
Yeah.
there was a way for you to bring people in so that the bloodline
Mhm.
was thinned a little bit, but still continue.
Yeah.
So I do believe that at one point they were not allowed to carry their swords.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. I think it was in the or wait, I thought it was that only they could carry their swords. No one else was allowed.
No, I believe it
Or-
was that they were not allowed to carry their swords, and
Mm.
that was a really big. So keep in mind that under that type of system,
Mhm.
your identity was these swords that you carried.
Yeah.
They identified you.
Yeah.
Period. No matter what else you were wearing,
Mhm.
if you were wearing swords, then you were a samurai.
Yeah.
And people treated you a specific way
Mhm.
based off of that fact. So one of the things that was done is that they initiated laws that said they were not allowed to carry them.
Yeah.
And what ended up happening is that upsets people. When you
Mhm.
take a person's identity,
Mhm.
it's one thing to say, hey, you're no longer the military force for us.
Yeah.
But when you take their identity, and we're
Mhm.
talking, like you said, a long history.
Yeah.
It incites people to really
Yeah.
not want to participate.
Yeah, and not just identity, but literal power. Like the influence
Exactly.
that they had gained.
Yeah, you lose you lose that. Plus,
Mhm.
at the same time, you're how do I say it? You're not farmers. You're not
Mhm.
artisans. You're warriors.
Yeah. What else are you?
So
Gonna
your family is
do?
not only not important, but you're not gaining any revenue.
Yeah, the skill you had is now not generating. income.
Yeah. So now the guy that makes fans has a higher status than you do.
Yeah, and to be fair, this is a pretty oversimplification of all that happened.
Correct.
Because
Yeah,
there's a lot
definitely.
that happened during that period.
Definitely.
But yeah,
definitely.
I thought that was an interesting method, and it also leads me to the data, because I think it's also a prime example of one thing we can look at. So there's a couple. There's actually, it was very interesting looking into research for this. Because there's a couple things we most commonly look at when it comes to running data and figuring out information on war and conflict. So we usually know that a huge chunk of stuff related to war and conflict is affected by population. We usually know that a huge chunk of things are affected by economic status. There's a bunch of things that are affected by the actual what it's made up of, if you're like a democracy or authoritarian government or something of that nature. But the data actually on conscription is a little weird in that regard. So specifically, I'm actually going to be referencing just for the sake of anyone that wants to look at this. I'm actually referencing a paper that's from the National Bureau of Economic Research that was done on conscription. This paper is by K.C. Mulligan and Andre Shelfer. So essentially what they did is they looked through a bunch of data, they looked through a bunch of countries, and they said, what are the things that a nation has that we can point to that predict how likely it is to engage in conscription? Again, most countries that use conscription actually use voluntary service as well. So it's usually a mixture. So it's really figuring out, why would a nation do voluntary recruitment versus a mixture of voluntary and conscription. But that being said, essentially, what are the things that make a nation decide to do this or that? And they found some pretty interesting correlations, I think. One of the ones that I actually didn't expect is that, funny enough, democracy actually has no correlation on whether you engage in conscription or not, which is really unique when you look at war and conflict, because a lot of war and conflict decisions are actually based pretty heavily on what your governmental system is. There's a lot of things that are affected almost primarily by whether you are a democratic nation, an authoritarian nation, a socialist nation, so on and so forth, because it determines what you're able to get away with, essentially, with your group or with your group of civilians, and what you can't. There is very little correlation, though, between conscription and democracies. The argument is that at the end of the day, democracies, well, there's a couple arguments, but one of them is that democracies tend to have a lot of like-minded people in at least a majority. That's how decisions are made, is by the majority group. So if you have a bunch of people that think the same, and your government is acting with that in mind, they're probably going to be acting in a way that you agree with, usually, or at least the majority of the population agrees with. So at the end of the day, if 60% of people are happy to vote for someone that goes to war, they're also probably in favor in some way of that war, if that makes sense. So this idea of the kind of majority think. Regardless, I thought that was actually really interesting, that democracy doesn't affect it seemingly at all. The things they were able to find correlations on are one is kind of an easy one, which is population size or population size of that military. So funny enough, the smaller the nation and the smaller the population, the more likely you are to actually just engage in voluntary conscription, because you don't really need to try that hard to get enough service members to defend that area. Also, there's a lot of upfront costs that we don't think about with conscription. Need to set, we kind of already talked about it, but you need to set up entire groups to monitor who's going to be conscripted, how they're going to be conscripted, why they're going to be conscripted, by what means they're going to be conscripted. Then you have to train all those people. There's a lot of costs to it. For those upfront costs, if you're a small nation, it doesn't really make sense to incur those if you can just get people to enlist, because you don't need a large force. So for example, like the USSR, actually, funny enough, when it was very first founded, had a voluntary system of conscription. They actually didn't move into, or a voluntary enlistment. They actually didn't move to conscription until later on. But in their voluntary enlistment days, they only had 300,000 men in 1918. By 1920, they had switched to a conscription model, and had 5,500,000 men. That's the kind of difference in manpower you can get by these. Now, if it was a small nation, 300,000 men might be plenty to defend it. But with the size of Russia, it makes far more sense for them to invest in a conscription system than otherwise. Now, China's in a similar boat. Funny enough, China actually had a universal conscription system, I learned, and then they literally had so many people that it wasn't sustainable. They couldn't train all those people. So they've actually moved to like a highly selective conscription system just by how their numbers are. But population is actually one of the big predictors of what system you're going to engage in.
Now, real quick, I would like to say that a lot of people assume that the reason there are exemptions is because it allows somebody to get out of something. However, they fail to realize the fact that those exemptions make it to where that country doesn't have to finance as many people.
Yeah.
You just basically were talking about that. Having too many people isn't actually good.
Yeah.
It's actually bad. It costs a lot of money. Plus, you lose a lot of manpower in other areas. You've gained a resource here. You've flooded that system with resources that you no longer can use somewhere else.
Yeah, no, exactly.
So they're not doing it for your benefit. They're doing it for their benefit each and every time.
Exactly. Yeah, and again, these are predictors. So this doesn't necessarily mean that it will always be the case. It's just something
That's true.
We find correlations with. The other thing they actually found, and this goes back to the example we used for Japan, but and this one I found very interesting because I had never thought of this. But if you look at and this is looking at modern states, so this isn't looking at how they were in the past. This is looking at the current modern layout of nations as of the 2000s, essentially. When we look at the nations that currently and still have engaged in conscription, there's actually a funny correlation between the system of law that the country was founded on, which I actually found very interesting. So I'll explain what that means. We can kind of cut up how a country decides its laws are to be created into a couple different categories. There's actually not that many as you would think. There's common law, which is English law. That's what our system is based on. It's based off the Magna Carta. It's based off the U.S. Constitution. It's based off of these things that can kind of be shared around. The ideals are kind of the same. There is French common law. There's the USSR common law. Essentially, the idea is whatever your nation was founded on, whether it was a colonial power that brought in that law system for you, or whether you voluntarily said, we're going to model ourselves after the US, we're going to model ourselves after the USSR, regardless of what it may be. Your legal system that is based off of actually determines pretty heavily as well whether you're going to engage in conscription. The most common countries that engage in conscription are actually from French colonies. Because the French, because of Napoleon specifically, have a very specific legal system that's set up around conscription. So it makes the barrier and the cost to engage in conscription very low. It makes it much easier. The first thing the French would do in their colonies, as well as in their own nations, was with Napoleon made this a very specific thing, was to set up a series for conscripting people into the military. It was a very important thing for the French law at the time. Any nations that based their laws off of France got that by proxy. So essentially, that concept that Napoleon used fed out to all other nations that engaged with it after the fact. It's the same with, I believe, British, or funny enough, people with common law are actually less likely to keep. They're less likely to do conscriptions over time for like a long period of time. Lots of nations will engage with it occasionally, but because of like the Magna Carta, because of how conscription was used by the King of England to essentially make people do whatever he wanted, it's not necessarily, it's kind of frowned upon in a lot of English common law based countries. So that was actually something I had not really considered, which is the legal system of a country kind of determining whether it engages with it or not. The idea being is that if it's easier to create, if the costs of making it happen are lower in something where it was already considered, you're more likely to do it.
And it's lucrative.
Yeah. When you look at the actual costs themselves, there is a pretty honestly, it's actually it can, if you can get past those original costs, it can actually be a lot cheaper to do conscription on a selective service model than it is to just do voluntary service.
Correct.
Depending on what you have.
Correct, because you don't have, with a voluntary service, you have to train them, you have to supply them, you have to pay them, and you have to house them.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of costs there. However, with a selective service, with a selective service, you have people that you can call upon when the need arises that meet a specific type of requirement that you're not actually, you paid for the system to get them, but you're not paying all of those people. You're just paying for the system to house their data.
Exactly. So yeah, and it seems like that's a big core. That's one of the main things I found is that the cost of entry, if it's low, makes you more likely to do it. And if it's high, which it is in a lot of other nations, then it kind of changes the system. So that's kind of what the data showed. I'm not going to get too nerdy into too many other sources because we're also a little. I think we're good on time now. Any last thoughts on conscription before we close it out?
Well, I think let's just wrap it up with who does conscription and who doesn't right now, or what are the numbers? So out of 191 nations, I'm seeing that it says that 85 have no laws authorizing conscription at all. 60 countries, conscription legally is authorized and being conducted in the same form. 23 have no regular military at all. There are 23 nations that have no actual military whatsoever. And then 23 have conscription laws in place, but not active. They're not actively drafting anyone. So they have the laws in place, but they're not actually engaging in it. Now, keep in mind that this data is only as good as the day a person put it down.
Yeah.
And those things can change quite rapidly. So I just think it's very unique that out of the 191 nations that there are 23 that have no standing military whatsoever.
Yeah. Demilitarization is an interesting topic in its own right, honestly.
So
I also think that data speaks to another. Go ahead.
I do want to clarify real quick that just because there are 23 nations in the 191 that don't have a military, that does not mean that they don't have laws for conscription.
Yeah. That also doesn't mean that they don't have military power. It just means they don't have a standing. Like they might still have nuclear weapons and things like that. I believe there's a couple.
Well, have no regular army. They may have a guard system or reserve system.
Like there is something I believe in place for them. It's just not as we understand it.
I'm just saying it's very. I did not realize that there were that many countries that did not have a regular army, like full time every day. Army.
I think that also speaks to an interesting idea that you also literally need less people in your standing army now with modern technology than you did before.
Correct.
One person can do far more now than they could 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 60 years ago or 100 years ago.
And if they have, and honestly, if you take an individual and you put them in a guard or reserve position and you keep them trained and they come in periodically and they're efficient with the equipment that they're provided, and that equipment is superior to the equipment of the enemy, you really only need them at the time when you actually need to engage that individual.
Yeah.
There's a cost benefit to not employing people every day when you are not actually using them for war fighting.
Yeah.
As in the U.S., we employ that to, quite honestly, to a large extent. We have a very large National Guard.
Yeah.
Now, all of those individuals can be to active duty service. So the National Guard is a state service.
Yeah.
But they can be activated to be used as active duty soldiers. They can be called up from state to the national level. The reserves are part-time national. They're not state. They fall under the federal government. They're federally funded. So one's state funded, one's partially, like Guard is state funded, but it also gets some money from
and the
correct.
and the reserves are essentially can be called up, but they're as well into active duty service.
Straight off federal. Yeah, they don't do state. They don't do state stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
Correct.
That makes sense.
So Guard can do state and federal things. The federal stuff can really only do federal things.
Yeah.
Within a lot of, I mean, there's some rules and some guidelines, but that's basically the basics of it. So even in this country, we have downsized the regular military, right? The federal military down quite a bit. And
I think it's like 0.1%
in some cases
of the population, I believe, or something like that.
We've upgraded these part-time soldiers because there's a cost benefit. You could still send them to Afghanistan. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
However, you're not paying them like we were in previous decades.
Yeah.
With the larger standing force, sitting at home doing nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. Right? 1% of the U.S. population is active duty.
Right. So I just thought it was a unique thing that we're not exempt from these. This isn't something that happens in third world countries or anything like that.
Yeah.
And to be quite honest, if conscription by itself is somewhat necessary, okay, in a world where someone can come and take your stuff. Okay.
Yeah. Or honestly, even a world where, like, as we talked about, where the world can just decide to want to destroy you. Like Mother Nature can just decide on it.
That's another one. Yeah. Natural disasters and things like that. So conscription is important. How you do it, though, is probably more important.
Yeah, I'd agree.
The draft in Vietnam, and I skipped over it in our history, only because I wanted to kind of close with it, is a prime example where we had laws in place that we were allowed to conscript people, but the population did not like it. And so it became a very ugly time in our history where there was a disparity between kind of factions. Honestly, people decided to take sides in it, and so there is something to be said for how you do conscription. Is probably more important than what your particular laws of conscription are. And that is a lesson that I believe is very important. That just because there's something in place that allows you to do it, you have to be careful how you do it.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense.
It could backfire on you very quickly.
Yeah, especially in a democratic nation where, at the end of the day, like political costs are high for people who engage in a particular thing.
I mean, even in a non-democratic country, if you do something that is so egregious against your population that they decide that they're not going to take it anymore, those people they don't just get fired; they get hung.
Yeah.
They have their heads chopped off.
Yeah.
So there's just a lot to it.
I agree. Cool. Well, we're at an hour and 55, so I think I want to close up. Any last thoughts before we do so, though?
No, I think that I had a lot of fun, and
Yeah.
thank you for allowing me to be here. And anybody that's listening, thank you very much for taking your time. I appreciate it. I know Kyle does.
Of course. No, of course we do. We do appreciate you listening. Again, if you are listening to us, you can catch us on any podcast service of your choice. Please give us a follow or a subscription, whatever that service uses. We are on YouTube as well. You can find this full video posted there. That's the full live version. If you're listening to this after the fact and you do want to watch us live, please come over to twitch.tv where you can watch us at the War Room Podcast. So that's just twitch.tv/the War Room Podcast. Give us a follow. You'll be able to see anytime we go live. Be sure to be on the lookout for our next episode we're going to do. I believe we're going to be doing it on African-American contributions to the U.S. military, which I think is going to be a very cool episode. I'm excited to do that for Black History Month.
Yes.
And I believe that's it. We really appreciate you listening. Please join us next time. Again, if there was anything that we always say this, but if there's anything we got wrong, if there's anything we missed or that we did incorrectly, please do let us know. You can email us at thewarchat@gmail.com. You can also DM us on Twitter, Facebook, any of those. That will get to us. Please let us know. Or if you just have any recommendations for what to do next, we also appreciate that. Any feedback you have is good feedback. But either way, we appreciate you listening. And with that, we will see you later. Oh, you
stay safe, stay healthy.
Yeah, stay safe, stay healthy. COVID is still a thing, and we do appreciate you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.